the United States has been pursuing a policy of prolonged attritional warfare, and that it's not a quagmire for the United States to pursue a policy of prolonged attritional warfare, because the underlying situation of the United States is dominance of global arms production. Well, it's certainly the case that we haven't moved into multipolar order, because multipolar order would imply the United States backing down and accepting spheres of influence for the major other powers.
How do you read the current strategy pursued by Beijing? Is China trying to build a new order, or simply securing a larger share of the existing disorder?
I'm not going to rule out the use of the category sub-imperialist, and I think there are two good examples, one of which is the Tsarist regime in the 19th century and down to 1917.
Mainly the questions sent by John Besh TV. I might add some comments.
And so on, and therefore also to trigger regime change. Moscow, creation of New Yeltsin.
Okay, on behalf of John Besh TV, who are hosting this, thank you very much for accepting their invitation for this conversation. I will ask mainly the questions sent by John Besh TV. I might add some comments. The comrades have asked me to make this more of a conversation, so there might be interventions beyond their questions, but I will try and keep those to a minimum. We start by their comments about the last conversation you had with them, which took place before the start of the 40-day war between the United States and Israel against Iran. And obviously, since then, a great deal has changed at the regional and global levels. So we would like to begin by revisiting that war and its wider implications. During the war, many analysts, including some Western strategists, did not expect Iran's military to show such resilience. How do you assess the confrontation and its outcome on the ground? More broadly, did the war mark a real shift in the balance of power, or did it mainly confirm your earlier view that direct military intervention pushes American hegemony deeper into irrational attritional quagmire? I'm going to add one minor point here, and that is also to talk about, in this session, if it's possible, to talk about those who argue that Iran has won this war, both amongst the international left, but also amongst those who are considered commentators, academics, and so on. Please go ahead.
Well, the short answer is it's too soon to tell. It's still very much too soon to tell. The idea that bombing was going to straightforwardly knock down the Iranian armed forces was never a terribly plausible story. It reflects lobbying from Israel on the basis of the story of the extreme fragility of the Islamic Republic, which was supposed to be capable of being knocked down by small-scale interventions. and also lobbying as one which recurs and has recurred episodically since the 1930s, the belief that air power is sufficient to win wars. Actually, since the 1920s, when the British tried to govern Iraq exclusively through the RAF bombing villages. But it's a sort of persistent idea of Air Force lobbyists. We can have clean warfare just by bombing and it resurfaces. That said, the other side of it, if we look at the Ukraine war, which is inextricably interlinked with the current war now, the United States has been pursuing a policy of prolonged attritional warfare. And that it's not a quagmire for the United States to pursue a policy of prolonged attritional warfare, because the underlying situation of the United States is dominance of global arms production, very radical dominance of global arms production, which means that usually at the end of the day, the United States is going to be able to carry on bombing and carry on blockading and carry on sanctions until the point that it finally exhausts its opponents. So the consequence of that, we've had a series of these stories of Iran has won, the war is over and Iran has won, the United States has had to give up. The memorandum of understanding was the clearest one, but at the same time, actually, it's quite clear that the war is ongoing, that major strikes have carried on over the last 24 hours, in the last 24 hours. Netanyahu is reported in the London Times before his meeting with Trump, saying he's going to urge on Trump that there should be no end to the war until regime change. Okay, that's Netanyahu's point of view. Coming out of the meeting with Trump, he's been more well, Zelensky's meeting with Trump has been more positive. The story is of Trump the warmonger, more of Trump the warmonger. So it really is. It's a bit like judging the First World War at the end of 1914 and thinking that Germany's winning. So I'm not going to say Iran isn't winning, but I think that actually for Iran to actually win, we'd need to be talking about sinking the US fleet rather than merely standing off attack. In a sense, survival is winning, but in another sense, it's not, because it's still the case that the hegemon power has the power to make life intolerable for you, has the power to inflict total destruction of infrastructure, has the power eventually to Somalify its target states, to Libyanize its target states, to Syrianize its target states. It will take longer to do that for the Islamic Republic, but at the end of the day, unless the United States is actually defeated, I said destroy the fleet, but it could equally be the case that if the whole of the region goes up in flames and the Egyptian regime falls and the Jordanian regime falls and the Saudi regime falls, that then the United States would be induced to back off, as Britain backed off on the question of Jewish settlements in the 1930s when the whole of the Arab area went up in flames. So that's, as I say, don't know is the answer to these ones. This one.
No, I realize. In our previous conversation, you argued against those sections of the left who are optimistic about a multipolar order. You said that global capitalism still requires a hegemonic power, that multipolarity is a shortcut to world war, With the genocide in Gaza, devastation in southern Lebanon, tensions in the Red Sea, the war against Iran, the widening regional spillover of these conflicts, do you think we are entering the practical phase of that crisis? Have we moved to a situation where we can say there is multipolar anarchy, but not multipolar order?
Well, it's certainly the case that we haven't moved into multipolar order, because multipolar order would imply the United States backing down and accepting spheres of influence for the major other powers, and creating something like Congress of Vienna or Conference of Berlin agreements from the 19th century. It's equally the case, actually, we haven't moved into multipolar anarchy of the sort which existed between 1918 and 1939, 40. And the reason for that is that we only entered into multipolar anarchy where it became clear that the United Kingdom was not capable of winning the war against Germany without United States assistance in 1914-18. So it's the need for United States assistance in 1914-18, the unwillingness of the United States to let Britain and France off their debt obligations to the United States in connection with the purchase of armaments in 1914-18 at the Congress of Versailles, which has the knock-on consequence that the Britain and France are required to impose major reparations on Germany and create. So this condition of multipolar anarchy is caused by the fact that the War of 1914-18 does not yet knock over the British state, as the fall of France and Norway and France and Scandinavia and the Low Countries in spring 1940s knocks over British hegemony and makes the British actually dependent on the United States. 1914-18, however, does create a condition of anarchy which persists until the conflict is resolved in 1939-45. So we aren't into that yet. If I'm sort of going to say, I think it's probably premature, because there's a sense in which we're nowhere near a new 1914, but there's a sense in which we may be near a new 1914. And in that case, we should analyze this chaos in the Middle East as being analogous to the Balkan Wars of 1911 to 13, which are the precursor to 1914, but not yet the outbreak of a world war.
That's very useful. Some argues that Russia and China are using Iran and other regional actors as a kind of geopolitical buffer, a kind of shield to absorb pressure that is coming from the West. I think you argued in the previous talks that China is currently not in a position to become the hegemon, the alternative hegemon. How do you read the current strategy pursued by Beijing? Is China trying to build a new order, or simply securing a larger share of the existing disorder?
I think we need to treat Russia and China separately. Apart from possessing nukes, Russia is very much a second-rate power, which is, in fact, not even properly characterized as sub-imperialist, I think. If Russia wins the war in Ukraine and the United States is unambiguously defeated, then Russia could become an imperialist power. But at the moment, it definitely It definitely isn't. And what seems to be on the agenda is actually colonization of Russia. We need to think of Putin from this point of view as analogous to Tipu Sultan, who was the great aggressor against allegedly, in the British press, the great aggressor against the East India Company in the 1790s, early 1800s. China is, and what Russia is essentially faced with the United States seeking to place and indeed actually succeeding in driving Russia's naval assets out of the Black Sea, and seeking to get control of the Donbass, the Caucasus, and so on, and thereby also the object is to trigger regime change in Moscow, the creation of a new Yeltsin, and as a result of that, a further breakup of the Russian Federation and the creation of a series of small states, which the United States will be able to control directly, thereby enabling US control of what Halvard Mackinder called the heartland, which means essentially the Caucasus, the Caspian, Central Asia. Okay, so this is that's the Russia situation, and the Putin administration is pursuing a defensive struggle against this existential threat from the United States. China is a very different situation. China has been, by virtue of becoming more and more capitalist. I don't think I'm going to say it's completely, this is a capitalist state, because it's a complicated story and it's still got large state-controlled corporations, as well as China is unlike Russia ever, in the sense that it had all the way through being a communist regime, an external financial capitalist operations in Hong Kong and in Singapore, which have been to a greater or lesser extent reintegrated in Chinese capitalism. And the consequence, in essence, is Chinese capitalism is driven towards imperialist operations, imperialist interventions, in the same way that the Kaiserreich in the late 19th century was driven towards imperialism by virtue of capitalist industrialization, and in particular the heavy industry sector became heavy lobbyists for creating German overseas investments and so on. China is driven towards overseas investments. It's also driven towards competition with the United States at the highest of high-tech levels, again, like the Kaiserreich in the later 19th century. And in that sense, but at the same time, it still remains the case that the United States is very absolutely dominant. It's more dominant in the world than the United Kingdom was in the later 19th century. So I don't think you're talking about a choice. I don't think that Beijing is at present in a position to become an alternative hegemon. I think Beijing could become, like the Kaiserreich, the battering ram which breaks down US hegemony and forces the United States into a more equal relationship with the European capitalist powers. But at the moment, we're nowhere near that sort of situation. And it's clear equally talk of India becoming a hegemon power is not plausible. So are they trying to secure a larger share of the existing disorder? That, I think, attributes too much. If we think about the Chinese Navy, too much aggressive quality to what they're doing. If we think about the Chinese Navy, it's been created and extended and pursued basing rights because China has been drawn into overseas investments, but also actually because the United States has pulled back from policing piracy, so that other states which have large trade investments have large shipping industries, have to pursue their own anti-piracy measures. Again, very similar to the dynamics of the later 19th century, in which the British Navy, because of the enormous cost of Britain maintaining a navy bigger than the next two navies, etc., the British began to pull back on the anti-piracy work, which depended on smaller ships and more of them and so on. And then other Germany, France, etc., were driven to expand their own naval power. The United States as well, in fact. Is that helpful?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. You referred to some of the escalation of the last few days before when we started. Obviously, now we have the Houthis who have declared a naval blockade against Saudi Arabia. They're considering a system of tolls on commercial shipping in the southern Red Sea. You have argued, and in the previous reply, you also referred to US military doctrine depending on control. And this control includes strategic energy and trade routes. At a time when competition over transit corridors has become quite a topical issue, these asymmetric forces managed to challenge America's control over the flow of goods and energy, or haven't they? And in this, what is the class character of the forces in Yemen and Iraq? Would you consider them anti-imperialist or militia-based actors seeking a share of regional trade routes? Here, the question avoids referring to the fact that both the Houthis and definitely the Shia groups that was hit yesterday in Iraq are close allies of Iran's Islamic Republic. And here I would add that for the last 47 years, more than 4.5 decades, Iran's Islamic Republic has never claimed to be anti-imperialist. It emphasizes it is anti-Western arrogance, which is, in my view, a nationalist view. But given this complicated setup, how would you assess the competition in terms of these naval blockades?
Okay, so the first point is this a challenge to the United States? And the answer is, my view of what the United States needs is veto control. That is the ability, not the ability to turn on the taps, but the ability to turn off the taps. And Iran turning off the taps themselves, or for that matter, the Houthis turning off the taps themselves, is not a challenge to the United States' geostrategic control, because the United States is an oil exporter. The United States is not is self-sufficient in petrochemicals. Okay, a bit more complicated, but it's certainly not the case that the United States, the turning off the oil taps damages the situation of the Europeans, it damages the situation of China, it damages the situation of Japan, it damages the situation of the Far Eastern countries more generally, but it doesn't directly damage the situation of the United States, unless the vassal states of the United States are so pissed off with the United States' failure to turn the oil taps on that they rebel against the United States, which they aren't doing at the moment. If we wanted to see, if we were expecting to see a European or Far Eastern rebellion against the United States, we would expect to see a totally different sort of nationalism, as opposed to Alternative für Deutschland, Meloni, etc. These guys are Atlanticists. They may want to shift the balance a little bit, but they're basically acting in the interests of the United States and not against the interests of the United States. So I don't think that you can talk about it's part of the left's belief that Iran is defeating the United States or similar stuff. It's a misconception of what the interest of the United States is in this stuff. The interest is in holding its capitalist rivals in the advanced capitalist countries in subordination, and that holding in subordination is by closing off their access to oil. And here in particular, we're concerned with closing off Chinese access to oil. It doesn't matter from the point of view of the United States, whether it's the United States which closes off the access or whether it's Iran and its allies which close off access in order to try and coerce the United States, because it doesn't work. Second question, an anti-imperialist movement or simply militia-based actors seeking a share of regional trade routes? I think that's a false counterposition. We can talk about there's a sense in which nothing can be anti-imperialist which is not posing some positive alternative to the regime, the global regime of imperialism. And there's a sense, in that sense, when the Islamic Republic doesn't say it's anti-imperialist, as Yassamine just said, the Islamic Republic is seeking a higher position in the global hierarchy, not to get rid of global hierarchy altogether. Whereas communists historically, and in fact, actually including the official communists in the period before 1991, seek to get rid of global hierarchy altogether. So in that sense, these are not anti-imperialist movements. In another sense, however, when we think of Comintern and what was called the Anti-Imperialist United Front, the idea of the Anti-Imperialist United Front was an extension onto the global scale of the Worker-Peasant Alliance, which took power in 1917. And the idea was that the working class as an international class and the Soviet Union ally with nationalists against imperialism, principally British imperialism. So hence the Congress of the Peoples of the East and Zinoviev presenting what the Comintern was doing as a kind of jihad. But the underlying stuff is it's not just Zinoviev. This is second and third Congress of the Comintern, fourth Congress of the Comintern on the national and colonial question. It's a geostrategic orientation which seeks an alliance between the Soviet Union, the workers' movement, and the nationalist movements in the colonial and semi-colonial countries. Okay, this was a plausible orientation, and indeed continued to be a plausible orientation right down to the 1970s, when the United States took a turn. It was you could imagine, the Soviet Union post 1945 added Eastern Europe, North Korea, revolutions under Soviet aegis added China, Vietnam, North Vietnam, and later South Yemen, Cuba, South Yemen. And in a sense, we had all these more or less left-wing nationalist governments of one sort and another. So this looked like a plausible strategy, but then the United States found the way to take it down in the 1970s by taking it apart through offering um, bank syndicated lending as a way of road to development, as an alternative to import substitution under import controls and aid and so on. And the squeeze at the same time, the squeeze, the Soviet Union's economy falling apart, Soviet budget falling apart, created the condition in which it ceased to be a serious option. So they're anti-imperialist in that sense of, the early Comintern talked about the Indonesian Islamist movement as an anti-imperialist movement, though they would never have called themselves anti-imperialist. Yeah. What's the man's name? Enver Pasha. Yeah. But of course, it was still the case, actually, that these nationalist movements were not seeking an end to global hierarchy, but merely to raise the positions of their own country in the global hierarchy, which was, of course, also true of the peasants in Russia or the peasants in China. They weren't actually seeking an abolition of social hierarchy, which was inconsistent with the character of peasant proprietors as patriarchs and employers. They were seeking to improve their own position in the social hierarchy. However, that's going a long way off that. Does that?
Yes, that's very good. I would just add, because I was asked this myself, I would argue that, yes, your definitions are perfectly correct. One problem is that because they don't challenge the world order, they often end up either compromising, as in the case of many of the Arab nationalists of 1960s and so on, or else they might go the route of a suicidal route of taking on enemies they can't afford to defeat, they are not in a position to defeat, and therefore creating a worse situation because of failing to have the support of ordinary masses to take on the imperialist powers. That's it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would add, in a sense, Vietnam, I may have said this before in one of these discussions, but the essence of the matter, the United States was defeated in Vietnam, not just by the military victory of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and not just by the fact that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were backed by the Soviet Union, which is too often forgotten, but also by the fact that because the perspective was a communist and universalistic one, that communist and universalistic one could animate an anti-war movement in the United States itself, which could reach all the way into the United States Armed Forces. And by reaching all the way into the United States Armed Forces, the United States could be driven to back off because they were threatened with their armed forces falling apart. In a sense, we can see a certain degree of sort of precursor of that in the guy in the interwar period, Smedley Butler, who was a general officer. He said, war is a racket. It was influenced by communism and the recognition that the United States' colonial wars, which he'd been deployed in as a Marine general, were conducted in the interests of US capital and not of the US citizenry as a whole. And the problem with the People's Front in the form of We Ally with Nationalists, or the Worker Peasant Alliance, say, surrounding the cities of the Global South, the victory project, the victory of the Global South, that project is incapable of reaching into and breaking up the armed forces of the imperialist powers.
That's right. Yeah. So another concept that is put forward by sections of the left in Iran and internationally is the concept of sub-imperialism. This includes often those who criticize campism. It also is used to describe the regional behavior of Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. These countries, according to this definition, are dominated at the global level. However, they still act hegemonically and exploitatively, and therefore are sub-imperialist. First of all, does this concept have any meaning in Marxist political economy? Is it a useful framework? Does it help to call Iran's Islamic Republic a sub-imperialist? Does it make us understand better its contradictions with the West and its bid for a share of the Middle East market? Or does it flatten the complexity of capital accumulation and geopolitical systems with simplistic labels?
Okay, I'm not going to rule out the use of the category sub-imperialist, and I think there are two good examples, one of which is the Tsarist regime in the 19th century and down to 1917, which was characterized by the fact that its economy was characterized by large foreign direct investment, substantial financial dependence on the core imperialist powers, Britain, France, Germany, etc. But at the same time, Tsarist Russia had its own financial structure and banking system, and exploited as colonial possessions the what's now the Central Asian republics, but also Siberia and so on and so forth. So in that sense, Boris Kagalitsky's very useful book, Empire of the Periphery. Russia was colonized as far as its core economy was concerned, but its core economy also colonized the subordinate territories. Second example is Portugal. Now, Portugal is a very different case because Portugal was the symbiosis of the Portuguese late feudal state together with Genoese finance capital between the roughly 1420s and 1560s, 1570s, and into later period, was one of the pioneers of extra-European imperialism. I say the symbiosis because you can't talk about the Portuguese state as being a capitalist state at this date, but at the same time, the relationship with the Genoese Republic, which undoubtedly is a capitalist state, and Genoese finance capital and shipping industry, Portuguese creates an entity which is a sort of very early form of imperialism. I can't remember what the exact date is. Portugal has a succession crisis and is folded into the Spanish Empire. But then in 1640 to 1660, the Portuguese break free of Spain, and the last stages of their breaking free of Spain is essentially under the aegis of the British. The royal government in Britain gets rid of its inconvenient Cromwellian soldiers in the former New Model Army by sending large numbers of them to Portugal to fight the Portuguese War of Independence with Spain. And then the upshot of that is that Portugal, although Portugal is no longer a front rank power, Portugal is subordinate to the UK and becomes increasingly the Portuguese domestic economy becomes increasingly colonized by British capital. But nonetheless, Portugal is also a colonial power which controls Brazil, Mozambique, Angola, and various other smaller, whole load of, well, smaller Macau, and so on and so forth. So Portugal, in that sense, is we can talk of Portugal right down to the 20th century as a sub-imperialist power because its economy is colonized at the center, but its colonizes has colonial possessions as a whole of its own, which it exploits in the usual way that imperialists do by exporting capital and getting a return back, and by financial dependence, and by imposing requirements on exports of the exports from the colonies for the benefit of the centre. However, in the Cold War period, there was a very strong tendency for any state which was somehow benefited or promoted by the central imperialist regimes to be characterized as and therefore stronger than other states in the region, to be characterized as sub-imperialist. And this stuff was exceedingly misleading. And I think anybody who characterizes Iran as sub-imperialist is sort of prima facie evidence that you're acting in the interests of the United States, because it's just it's confusing holding other countries in economic subordination for the benefit of the metropolitan economy, which is the essence of capitalist imperialism, with merely having stronger political power and intervening in the affairs of neighboring countries, in which case you might as well call, again, Tipu Sultan of Mysore, we'd say Tipu Sultan is a sub-imperialist. No, this is not serious analysis.
Thanks. That's a very good distinction, and the historic examples help, because then you can look for Iran's colonies.
Yeah.
In terms of the current war, we are seeing geographic boundaries being collapsing increasingly. We have Ukraine's entry into confrontation with Iran. There's reports of attack on Iranian ships in the Caspian Sea. So you could say there is a widening overlap between the Eastern European war and West Asian security. At the same time, the Iranian government and its foreign minister appear to be pursuing a contradictory line. They stress defense, they are trying to avoid regional escalation, while they are becoming more and more dependent on Russia, China. Can we say Iran is now trapped in a geopolitical situation that forces it to coordinate? I would say with big vision, because I don't think Moscow dictates what's going on, but you can reply yourself. Even when that coordination brings it into confrontation with the West beyond the Middle East.
Okay, I don't think the West is a useful category. It's basically self-image of the United States and its vassal states. Okay, derived ultimately from Spengler and the image of, quote, the decline of the West, and then we get into Tolkien's Numenor. I raised Tolkien's Numenor because we've got Palantir taken from Tolkien, and Anduril taken from Tolkien. So this sort of, in much the same way as the image of the West was a occultist, was connected with Nazi occultism and Atlanteanism, stories of Atlantis, fallen Atlantis, which turns in Tolkien into Numenor. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and so on is coming up in the tropes of the U.S. military industrial complex at the present date, in very much the same way that it came up in the tropes of the I can't remember what the SS institution was, which did this sort of Atlanteanism and occultism in the 1930s, 1940s. So the West is a very unhelpful category. What you're talking about is, are you faced with, brought into sharper confrontation with the United States and its vassal states? It's important to recognize that, precisely because before the Iraq War, before the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance redefinition of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, the European powers, particularly France and Germany, and to a lesser extent the UK, pursued independent diplomatic relations with Iran and independent diplomatic relations with the Arab states in general. And in that situation, that could happen again. It's just that in order for it to happen again, there needs to be a political overthrow in Europe of the political institutions by which the United States controls the domestic politics of the European countries around insistence on backing Israel. Russia-China axis is problematic. It's clear that Russia and China, I've talked already about the fact Russia and China are in different situations. What China seems to be doing is hoping to survive, but also actually hoping to outbuild the United States in high tech. And there does seem to be some serious perspective of the United States potentially China outbuilding the United States in high tech, but also actually to radically reduce its dependence on petrochemicals through increased emphasis on renewable energy of one sort and another. So that although that doesn't mean that China is reducing carbon emissions, it does mean that the need for oil is pushed into motor transport and aircraft rather than applying across a whole wide range of Chinese act. So China is essentially trying to reposition itself, but also to reposition itself in terms of independent diplomatic and trade relations with other countries, to create its independent payment system so that it's less dependent on SWIFT, to draw down slowly, to some extent, its heavy investment in United States treasuries as foreign exchange reserves. But at the same time, without going for outright confrontation with the United States. Whereas the United States is pushing for increasingly sharply for aggressive encirclement of China. In this context, I think if you look on Responsible Statecraft 2 days ago, Zelensky's big idea for Trump, Ukraine is the Israel of Europe. Okay, responsible statecraft. It's a leftish, quote, realist think tank. But nonetheless, it is undoubtedly the case that the Ukrainian regime is essentially attempting to sell to the United States that the Ukrainian regime will become a highly militarized military industrial complex, immediately dependent on the United States in Eastern Europe, playing the same role in Eastern Europe that Israel plays in the Middle East. And the Ukrainian attack on Iranian ships in the Caspian, although it can be sold as being it's really an attack on Russian trade in the Caspian, presents part of that, is part of that diplomatic game. Having said that, it is also the case that it represents the extent to which Ukrainian attacks have reached in terms of their distance within the Russian Federation, makes the continued survival of Ukraine into an existential threat to the Russian Federation. So that it's very, very difficult for the various deals of freezing the borders or anything like that no longer make sense, and any more than the two-state solution in Israel-Palestine makes sense, because the United States has already achieved Ukraine as a institutional base for targeting any part of the Russian Federation. And preventing Russia from, and the United States has already achieved driving the Russian Navy out of the Black Sea, and so on and so on and so forth, so that it's the US and its vassals in that sense are continuing to pursue an aggressive policy. This is it's a very curious thing, because it's the German state, for example, pouring vast resources into backing Ukraine, but this is actually at the expense of Germany. Macron has been backing Israel in relation to the Lebanon, but this is actually at the expense of French interests. So just that sense of just how much it's not economic control of the United States. The Europeans are not a colony of the United States. There's political control of the United States in the same way as before 1860, the UK had political control of the United States through the Confederacy, not the Confederacy, the slave owner power. And the UK had political control of Germany through the non-unity of Germany. That's it. I hope that.
No, that's very clear. Thank you. So this last question really refers to some of the confusion in the Iranian left. Many of it are my views, not that of John Beshkili, but also at the end a question on that. So we've seen significant divisions within the Iranian left as this war has developed. On one side, we have sections of what I would call the reformist left, some of them with Stalinist background, some without that, who have returned to their 1979, post-79 position of unqualified support for the Islamic Republic, or near unqualified support for the regime, and argues that the regime's survival is a political achievement that we should celebrate and therefore support it. And any criticism is actually supporting the United States. On the other end of this political spectrum, we have people who self-describe themselves as the radical left. I would define them as social imperialists. As they say, this is we can't call this a war of aggression by an imperialist power, because I assume they think if you go with that description, you inevitably have to support the Islamic Republic, as they don't want to define an aggressor and an attacked state. And within these groups, we also hear arguments that Iran is as responsible, equally culpable about this war as the US and Israel. Right? Why? Because it supported the Palestinians, because it followed the nuclear program, forgetting that the nuclear program was actually the Shah's program and was completely uncontroversial until the early 2000s, when Bush decided Iran was part of the axis of evil. It wasn't an issue until then. My own argument, as you know, has been that there's no reason why one could not argue that this is a war of imperialist aggression, but at the same time refuse not only to endorse the Islamic Republic, but argue that a reactionary capitalist state, although it has the right to resist attacks by Israel and US, will inevitably either concede to the demands of the West or take us to a kind of martyrdom of the whole country. War until victory, which is the slogan of sections of the Islamic Republic. And in this, the defeat will be for the Iranian working class as well as the country. Now, given this scenario, with which you might disagree, and I would like to hear your views on that, it is correct that you have in the past rejected both this defeatism for the opposition forces in Iran, but also you have strongly argued against supporting tyrannical regimes such as the Islamic Republic. In that context, how would you argue workers, the women's movement, progressive forces, not just in Iran, but in the Middle East, can build independent and genuinely progressive alternatives at a time when we have continued US bombardments, continued Israeli aggression, a policy of destruction, as well as not just the repression of their local governments, but the capitalist politics of these governments that has created corruption, dissatisfaction.
Okay. I start with we have to break with the assumption that you have to make a choice between alliance with the democratic bourgeoisie, which turns into actually support for, quote, democratic imperialism. And democratic imperialism. Trotsky, I think in the 1920s rightly said the democracy of the imperialist powers is like the democracy of Athens, which ruled over disenfranchised slaves, women, but also actually over disenfranchised colonies in the Aegean, in classical antiquity. Yeah. But in connection with the other side of it is that the alliance with the democratic bourgeoisie. The Libya is the clearest example of the guys who, of the people like the Mandela Fourth International, like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty and others, argued that we should support US intervention against the Gaddafi regime in Libya in order to protect for humanitarian reasons. What's the outcome? Not in any sense a humanitarian outcome, but just a failed state and endless civil war. So that on the one hand, the alliance with the democratic bourgeoisie or anti-fascism, you talk about the anti-fascist left, the people who imagine that what's going on is Second World War and we have to be on the side of the democracies against fascism. It's delusional, and we can see that it's delusional in the sense of the outcome of US and allies interventions. on the other hand, the other guys argue for the People's Front with national capital against comprador capital and against imperialism, the anti-imperialist United Front. But equally, just as much, okay, the clearest example of that was the bits of the left which argued for support for the Taliban against US imperialism. Of course, the Taliban would have shot the left before they fired off any guns at US imperialism, and did, in fact, shoot at the left before they fired off any guns at US imperialism. It's so that both the line of the alliance with democratic capital and the line of the alliance with a national capital are illusory. Yeah. Neither capital is neither reliably democratic nor reliably national. Okay, so then the problem is, okay, well, the answer, which the objection, which is very common, is, okay, but you're saying there's very little we can do. Well, we can do things at a low level, building trade unions, building cooperatives, fighting over rents, fighting over elementary things of that sort. But at the same time, we can do them in conjunction with really high-level political aims. Yeah. And the high-level political aims, just in the long term, we aim for global communism. We aim for the total abolition of this global hierarchy between states and peoples, but equally of the hierarchy which says that businesses that capitalists are entitled to exploit those below them, that religious leaders or other such are entitled to a free pass, that landlords are entitled, and so on and so on. So we're against all forms of our strategic aim is global communism against all forms. Secondly, our next level down is regional common action of the workers' movement, and with a view to taking political power on a regional scale. And the reason why on a regional scale is because if it's on a regional scale, if we take political power in Europe, it's difficult for the United States to strangle the movement by sanctions. Whereas we've seen in Iran itself, in Venezuela, in numerous other cases. Indeed, the British successfully strangled land reform in Zimbabwe by imposing merely financial sanctions, thereby causing a collapse of the currency. It needs regional coordination in order to be able to take regional continental action, in order to be able to take a section of the world out of capitalist rule, in order to have effective planning of industrial and agricultural production and all the other things which need to be done, and thereby in order to hold off, not necessarily to actually victoriously defeat the United States of America, but to just stand off and be able to create something which looks plausible as an alternative. In one country, we can't do that. We will be strangled too quickly. Thirdly, going along with that, our aims need to be aims of radical democracy. And the Soviet and East European case is illustrative of why that's necessary, which is that if you try and do something other than capitalism without radical democracy, the managers tell lies and in order to keep the managers tell lies in order to keep their jobs. The result of the fact the managers tell lies in order to keep their jobs is that the workers below them tell lies about how much work they're doing, and we wind up with the Soviet planning irrationalities and the old joke, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. They pretend to pay us because the money can't function as money, and the plan is incapable of producing the consumer goods which people need. We pretend to work because the natural response to that is to, okay, if whatever, however many rubles I get, that's not going to actually get me the stuff which I need, then I still have to stand in queues, etc. I may as well minimalize the amount of work I do. And in order to overcome that, but also just in order for there to be something which looks more like an alternative to capitalism, we need radical democracy. Okay, so then these are grand aims. What you're doing in practice inevitably is not you're going to launch an insurrection, you're going to launch a general strike, etc., etc., etc. What you're doing is you need to do the very what the guys call base building, but you need to do what the guys call base building in the context of a projecting a political alternative, which is a realistic political alternative, although it's a realistic political alternative which you can't leap with one leap into the kingdom of freedom. It has to be, we aim for building an opposition which opposes effectively and in a coordinated fashion across the region. I don't know. No, I don't know where comrades in the region can begin. I can imagine places where we can begin in Europe. I can imagine places where the Latin Americans could begin. I can sort of imagine that there might be places where people in the Middle East could begin. But the first step is to break with both the idea of unity with the anti-fascist, quote, anti-fascist leftism, and unity with the, quote, democratic bourgeoisie, and with, quote, anti-imperialist leftism, and unity with the nationalist bourgeoisie. That's not saying we don't oppose imperialism. We do oppose imperialism. We're opposed to the entire hierarchical structure of the world economy and the world system of states. And for that reason, actually, Yassamine, you said it, we need one of our principal tasks, particularly the principal task of people in the imperialist countries, is to oppose our own imperialist countries' wars of aggression and disciplinary wars, which is what these things are, which are about enforcing the subordination of other people to the imperialist states, the center. Is that?
That makes sense. Thank you very much. That was, we've really taken a lot of your time, but that's perfect. That's covered the questions, and I'm sure the translation will cover what we have said. Thank you very much. Let me stop.